The title of my talk is, Who Do You Think You Are? And it's the Buddhist teaching really is that the teaching on anatta, or no self, is that this sense of self that we develop as human beings is really a fabrication of our mind. And it really can be such a kind of odd inquiry, because we're really quite committed, aren't we, to this sense of an individual self. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how that works, because when we think about healing separation, the Buddha's teaching is basically there is no separation to heal. It's really about healing the mind that thinks there is separation. And indeed, we can apply the same kind of thinking to any sense of healing the earth. You know, this sense of all the destruction that we can offer when we think we're separate, when we think that the earth is somehow something that's other and that we can treat it as other. Joanna Macy is one of the key teachers on ecology and deep ecology and Buddhism. And here's a quote from her. She says, "Notice how every religion and spiritual tradition gives guidance on what to do with the self, with its clamoring wants and needs. Some paths tell you to punish the self, others to improve and ennoble it. Buddhism asks us simply to see through it as a fiction or illusion. Every tradition also includes teachings that expand the self in widening circles of identification. You can learn to draw the circle of the self so wide that the body of earth becomes your larger body, with the rivers like your veins, the rainforests your lungs. Through our desire to protect what we love, we can recognize our interconnectedness with all of life." So, a lovely link of anatta with Earth Day. So I wanted to start with just how do we get a sense of separation in the first place, because it's just so strong for us. And I wanted to play with that a little bit in terms of who do you think we are? And here, I mean play sort of literally. You won't have to speak with one another if you don't like to do that. But I want to just do a little exercise. And if you would, indulge me, if you would just stand for a moment. So in terms of who do you think you are, some of us think we're girls and some of us think we're boys. Okay? So I'm going to just ask you if you would kind of organize yourselves in according to how you think, who you think you are in that, along that continuum. So maybe we could have one group over here, we could have another group over here. We'll have the boys group over here because there's a boy there, and we'll have a girls group over here. So it's pretty strong, isn't it, this sense of identity, and we can even kind of feel it, can't you? You know, as you kind of organize into self and other, you know, that now that we got, you know, this is a self that is quite different from the other. And it can be really quite a shock to realize that any sense of gender identity, actually when I even invite you to organize into, you know, male and female, it's rather insulting to quite a lot of people who don't identify themselves in that way. So I really bow to that and honor that. In many cultures, there actually are more than 2 gender identities. In Indonesian, there's a culture in Sulawesi that has 5. In India, there's a culture that has 3. And on Facebook, perhaps some of you know this, there are, count them, 56 options for gender identity, with the understanding that gender identity is, in fact, a socially constructed notion. I mean, and we say, no, that can't be right. It's physical, right? So without going into all the science of it, it's a socially constructed identification. So gender identity. Okay, so, what? Sure.
My son is a year over in college, and I went to visit him one time, and I asked him, I said, where's the ladies' room? And he looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, Mom, we don't have those here. And I said, what? And he said, no, we don't have those here.
Yeah.
We just go to the bathroom like we do at home. Like you girls shower, whatever. No, we don't have those here.
Yeah. So the sense of this socially constructed reality to which we can become quite identified. How about other things in terms of who do you think you are? How about, this is a little more subtle, you have to kind of look a little bit. How about like color of eyes? Can we have all the people with dark eyes over here, brown eyes, all the people with blue eyes down there, and all the people with, say, green eyes or heather eyes or gray eyes there. And again, we can recognize that there's incredible gradations here. You say, well, which group do I belong to? I don't know. And we can begin to notice the size of the group begins to matter, doesn't it? Yeah, Linda? Well, there's another one. What about age? Here's one where it's sort of, this isn't like, physical characteristics, but now we have to kind of add in our own processing about it. So what about age? How about if we have all the old people here, and all the young people over there, and all the people who, are kind of in the middle over there? I forget where I put people. Well, but that's just it, isn't it? That's just it. But it's true, isn't it? Billy just asked, well, how old is old? But isn't that part of our social construction? How old is old? And it really is how we think about it. But then we start to inhabit these constructions, or we look at somebody else, and we know something about them because they are young, or they are old. So that we now kind of begin to kind of have a sense of self and other. I can't relate to this person because they are different from me in some particular way. I have a whole bunch of these. We're not going to do them all or we'll be here all night. How about just a couple more? How about people who are parents? Let's have all the parents over here, and then we'll have people who are not parents over here. And you won't believe this, but but it took me as a step-parent, I was very young, so I guess I'll excuse myself in that way. As a step-parent, it took me probably about 3 years to figure out that I was a parent, that it was such a bizarre kind of thing. Okay, now we have another source of self and other, ways that we are different from each other. And I don't see, is Pat still? I did this for Pat. I was going to say we can reference people by what we value or do, and I thought we could have a group of Red Sox fans and everybody else. But I think Pat left, so Holly, are you a Red Sox fan? No, okay. So anyway, all right, that's good. So I just wanted to kind of embody this sense of, just how we kind of begin to think of, here I am, who in some way is other than who you are. we'll explore that a little bit more. So come back to your own seat. So we develop this sense of self really from the moment we're born and somebody declares us a certain gender. And we kind of, over the course of a lifetime, really construct this sense of self by all these different characteristics. So then I am a female with green eyes, right-handed, tall or short, I don't know, medium, old, middle-length hair, non-athletic, not a student, a parent. We have all these different kinds of categories. And if we kept going, what we would end up with is one person in each category, wouldn't we? Because there'd be all these different combinations. And then there is me, who is this sort of, if you will, unique person, all of which are constructed. They're all ideas that we have. Even gender. Again, I've got about 2 pages in here about gender identity, which is a whole separate talk. But that gender identity is actually quite complex and is a social construction. Not specifically related to our physical characteristics, interestingly enough, even though we sort of assume it is. There were quite a number of identities that I didn't ask you to divide yourselves into, because some of them can be quite tender and can really feel really challenging. Our sexual orientation, our ethnicity, race. Race, too, is a social construction. Here. Race is a classification system used to categorize humans into large and distinct populations or groups by anatomical, cultural, ethnic, genetic, geographical, historical, linguistic, religious, and or social affiliation. First used to refer to speakers of a common language, and then to denote national affiliations. In the 17th century, people began to use the term to relate to observable physical traits. Such use promoted hierarchies favorable to differing ethnic groups. Race is a social construction. You can't really kind of narrow it down to some kind of unique qualities or unique characteristics. Class, our social class and age. Who do you think you are, Democrat or Republican? Okay. Christian, that one's true, huh? Christian, born again, infidel, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu. Smoker, non-smoker, hunter, vegetarian, environmentalist, ecologist, sexual orientation, heterosexual, homosexual, transsexual, bisexual, genderqueer, all kinds of orientation. So that we generate, in the course of our lives, we generate this sense of self socially. People tell us who we are, and we learn who we are by our preferences, by our orientation, by things we're comfortable with. And we make an in-group and an out-group of some sort. And then we start to either long for connection with the other group or go to war in some particular way. Charles Darwin proposed that all life evolved from one primordial form. And for a lot of years there was a lot of, contest about that. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. And it wasn't possible to define the genome clearly enough to really kind of support it or refute it. And apparently recently in biological research, they're able to kind of characterize the genome clearly enough such that there is compelling evidence to support Darwin's common ancestor theory. Until we were able to readily sequence genomes from many diverse organisms, it was not possible to apply rigorous statistical tests to this idea. Douglas Theobald at Brandeis University described such analyses done in a recent paper published in the prestigious journal Nature. He concluded that there was less than a 1 in 10 to the 2,860th chance that all life did not arise from a common ancestor. 10 to 2,860 is 10 is 1 followed by 2,860 zeros. An incredibly large number. So less than, the chance that that is not the case is less than 1 in whatever that number is. So who do you think you are? So this sense of our identity, our sense of self, this social construction. Stephen Colbert, years ago, I heard him say in the quippy way that he says, who am I if not you? So this way that we identify ourselves as somehow different from, separate from, this phenomenologically, we have a sense that this thing is sort of independent and separate, but it doesn't really take a whole lot of investigation, either in the way that I'm proposing to you, or we could also propose it ecologically in terms of our relationship with nature and biology, to realize that it's actually just simply not true that we are independent self beings, even though we function as though it were true, and it's a useful fiction. So we're not proposing, the Buddha did not say the Buddha did not say there is no self, as in, somehow no self exists. He said that our sense of self does not exist in the way that we think it does. It's a mental fabrication. And if we don't understand it as a mental fabrication, as a way of organizing data and as a way of organizing our social intercourse, that we'll get confused and start to relate to the world as though it were disposable, other beings as though they were disposable, as though somehow I can exist in some sort of independent way. In its most basic teachings, our Buddhist practice cultivates freedom from suffering in wholesome, wise, compassionate thoughts and actions with other beings. All other beings. That's the basis of non-harming. It's not like it's just sort of a nice thing to not harm. It's understanding that we are connected to all beings. And if we harm other beings, we are harming ourselves, sort of along the lines of Joanna Macy's quote. I have friends who are monastics who are prohibited by the Vinaya, by the monastic code, from gardening, which is sort of sad. But they're prohibited from killing the organic matter that we kill when we garden, and from disturbing the animals, the insects. So they actually can't, my friend Alma was here, can't clean up her own yard because the Vinaya proposes that they not harm. And again, it's not like there's somehow something, in the behavior itself, so much as just this deep understanding of our interconnection of all beings. So the Buddhist practice, the Buddhist teaching, is not like a series of things to do well, but it's a map to understanding how the world works. and how we work in relationship with other people. Sort of it's a recipe, if you will, for freedom from suffering. How do we do this? So I wanted to talk just a little bit about how we become, or when and how we develop this sense of self as separate. And then, let's just see what I have time for. Well, I'll talk about this a little bit. When this organism is first in the world, we start to kind of navigate through our sense impressions. We start to see things. And we start to hear things. And the way the sense organs in this human body work, the Buddha noticed in his discovery, is that there develops, just by the sensory contact, that there develops this sense of an I who is seeing, and an I who is hearing something that the impression is that it's coming from the outside because of our human sensory experience. So he talks about this contact that we make, and that the world kind of, the becoming, if you will, of our world through sensory contact. And that we then kind of take this sense of sensory contact to be something that is solid and true and real, and more real than it actually is. It's the way the mind regulates energy and information flow, by kind of having this sense of a self and an other. Pay attention to this and not that. In animals, there's a sense of this territory is mine, and the leaves here are mine to eat. So that there's this sort of sense of a very kind of primitive and fundamental organism that is trying to kind of help itself stay alive and safe by establishing this sense of self and other. Some of you have heard me say I was out one day walking, and I overheard this little boy asking his grandfather, he was walking by a group of flowers, and he said, "Grandpa, do we like this kind of flower?" You know? But it's really what we do as children, isn't it? You know? Do we like the Democrats or the Republicans? You know? I remember as a child, I was raised Catholic, and I went to a Catholic school, and I felt so sorry for all those poor people who just had to suffer through public school when I got to, have this incredible privilege of being in the right one. But it's how we're socialized, isn't it? It's how we learn how to identify ourselves. Like, I'm Catholic and I'm better than you are. So this little boy was asking his grandfather, how do we think about this? David Aronson talks about a little girl in Japan who was asked in school what her favorite color was. And it was a foreign concept because in a Japanese culture, at least at the time, there was a much more of a sense of group. A group is more of a self. A family is more of a self. And so she had no idea how to identify something that I like. And so she went home and she asked her mother what our favorite color is. She didn't know how to answer. What's our favorite color? So in many cultures, this sense of self is less tied to a physical body as to a family or a tribe. I just read the book, I Am Malala, and it's so interesting because in it she talks about this sense of tribal identity in a way that really helped me understand it and helped me be much more sympathetic to the understanding of just the organization. There, the self is much more organized around the tribal identity. So the self is a larger body, but nevertheless equally to be defended. This territory is mine, and these leaves are mine to eat. This sense of self. So in humans, I am this and not that. And this territory is already occupied, and the food here is ours. So the brain, as we begin, as little babies, the brain begins to organize in the interest of helping us maintain some sense of stability, some sense of safety, some sense of survival. Very ancient kinds of mechanisms for us that in some ways don't work so well for us anymore, do they? My theory, my personal theory, is that the Buddha 2,600 years ago was really at the front edge of this next wave of evolution, of really teaching us that there's more, there's a kind of a wider expanse of understanding and a wider way of viewing this being alive than the kind of more fundamental and more animal way of viewing it that we come from. This is from Rodney Smith. He says, once we have been established, we start to believe that reality is external to ourselves. We then start perceiving and arranging the data to suit our desires and fears. The Buddha saw that too, that once we get a sense of what's true, then we start to perceive all new information through the filter of what's true, of what we believe to be true, of what we have come to believe to be true. And then we start to tell ourselves stories about it and remember stories about it, which just tends to solidify all of that sense of self. So he says, once we have been established, we start to believe that reality is external to ourselves. We then start perceiving and arranging the data to suit our desires and fears. And then we act upon reality as if it could be aligned with our own needs and wants. That is when all hell breaks loose, because reality is not divided, and acting upon reality as if we were separate creates the pain and suffering of the world. The fundamental principle we must remember when traversing a spiritual path is that we do not have a mind. The mind has created a sense of you and me from the way it perceives reality. The truth is, the mind holds us within it. We are not the possessor of a mind, and the mind is not something happening to us as if we were outside looking in. We are a part of the mental processing of the mind. The thoughts of the mind and the sense of I are not two separate events. We exist only because the mind thinks us into creation. I think it was Ajahn Sumedho who said, you have to think about this carefully or your brain will explode. Which I thought was really nice. This sense of self and no self, of interrelatedness and interconnection. You have to think about it carefully or your brain will explode. So it isn't like it's just like, oh, okay, fine, I don't exist or something like that. But to begin to challenge the solidity of our sense of a separate self. And it really is applicable, isn't it, to Earth Day as well. So we cannot really understand how to work with separation unless we understand that we are not ever really separate in the first place. We cannot understand how to work with separation unless we really come to deeply understand that we were never really separate in the first place. In our deluded minds, we then take this sense of separation and we try to establish a sense of connectedness, by, from this self to that self. It never quite works, does it? All of these relationships, it's like it's good except for that. But we also tend to kind of look to establish connection by looking for people who have some of these defining characteristics that are the same, That I can only be people of the same race, intimate with people of the same racial group, or the same class, or the same age, or the same sexual orientation, or the same gender identity. Because we are fundamentally different. So that we tend to then, organize and try to have intimacy through what my teacher Gregory Kramer calls a sense of constructed intimacy. This sense of, I can be intimate with people who are like me. In one of these, the categories, I had you moving around, if we really kind of just, each of us kind of, invented, thought, well, what other categories? We would be here for a week, wouldn't we? Or more. If we just kept moving ourselves around with all the different ways that we organize ourselves. And at a party, all the ways that we kind of orient to people who are somehow like me. And otherwise, we have, I don't know how to talk to you, if you're not like me in some important way. So Gregory calls that constructed intimacy. And he calls unconstructed intimacy the kind of intimacy that Rodney Smith is talking about, where we rest in awareness and cultivate the capacity to see the arisings internally and externally as simply phenomena that are arising, and the attachment of the mind to these arisings as just the attachment of the mind. That the mind then says, this is important. And again, if we go back to our animal nature, this territory is mine, these leaves are mine to eat. This is important somehow. That in awareness we can see the conditioned mind. It's not like this conditioned mind is bad or wrong. We all have it. It's part of being human. But that we can see it as constructing. We can see it as a fabrication, basically. And we can loosen our hold on it and loosen our, the intensity of our belief that somehow I can act in a way that's independent of, the rest of the world. I won't go there because we don't have time. So if we don't understand the nature of things, we will imagine that happiness is something that we acquire by getting more of something that I want. And so the Buddha's invitation is to cultivate over time. You have to think about this carefully or your head will explode. To cultivate the awareness that I can let go of my individual wants and needs. They can be much softer. I can explore the commonality and the awareness that all beings simply want to be happy with all of this diversity. And then with that kind of intimacy, we don't want to know what is other, what doesn't fit. We can see that with new friends, or we can see the ways with new friends we kind of look to that kind of constructed sense of self. We can even see it with ourselves internally. That place where there are certain qualities. It's sort of like, we can kind of take this, as a world all of itself. And, we're kind of at war sometimes with certain aspects of ourselves. And it's really the same sort of thing. That we have constructed ideas that certain aspects are unacceptable, fundamentally unacceptable. And so therefore I have to exclude them from my awareness. So the Buddha invites us to really soften our sense of the hold that we have on these, this sense of who do I think I am, and to relax more and more into what Gregory calls unconstructed intimacy. Here's Gregory on this. He says, unconstructed intimacy arises in the depths of interpersonal meditation, which is what he teaches, but is not something someone does. It arises in and of itself in the absence of ignorance and hunger. In unconstructed intimacy, the only residence we take up is in the moment itself. Unconstructed intimacy is not a thing we can make or even positively define. Rather, it is the empty field of interbeing, the unprecipitated between. Unconstructed intimacy, like personal liberation, is available to us any time, but in the noise and stress that make up the usual state of our hearts, it usually remains an unrealized potential. So the antidote to separation is awareness, is wisdom, is understanding how things really work. Going back to Joanna Macy's quote, she says, every tradition also includes teachings that expand the self in widening circles of identification. You can learn to draw the circle of the self so wide that the body of earth becomes your larger body, with the rivers like your veins, the rainforests your lungs. Through our desire then to protect what we love, we can recognize our interconnectedness with all of life. So our weekend retreat will be exploring further how the Dharma can illuminate issues of social separation and injustice. And primarily by remembering that we're not separate at all. So, happy Earth Day and blessings.